Is it possible to get eval or even full featured lab licenses that we can use in our lab environment? The answer is absolutely yes. And in this nugget, we're going to take a look at exactly how. I'd like you to think back to the last time that you were on a commercial aircraft. Visualize yourself sitting in your seat, waiting for the plane to take off, and I'd like to ask you some questions about the pilot and the co pilot. Is it possible that this is their first time ever flying an aircraft? And the answer is no. They have had tons and tons of practice, including a lot of practice in simulators, and they've gone to classes at ground school to help study up and get them ready to make sure that they are prepared. In addition, it's very likely if they're flying a commercial aircraft that they have hundreds of hours of flying time in those aircraft as well. Well, for the benefit of us, as we learn F5, we definitely want to practice on the real gear if possible, and we want to do it in our own lab environment so we don't cause any harm to production networks. And one of the challenges is how do we get that software running in our lab environment? And we have really three cool options. We can actually download a 90-day Big IP eval, which includes the LTM module, that's the local traffic manager. And we can download that as a virtual appliance and plug it into our virtualized environment so we can practice with it. Another option that we have is we could purchase what are known as lab licenses. And as of this week anyway, they're about $100 a piece. And the reason I mention a piece is because if you want to practice high availability, you're going to want to have two licenses. Or if you don't want to buy a lab license and you still want to practice with all the features, you can request a full featured evaluation from F5. And that would be our third option in a test environment to work with and practice with F5, short of purchasing the entire product for thousands and thousands of dollars. And as of this recording, here is the URL that you could go to. And if that URL changes over time, no problem. You could use Google to find out what the current link is to get you to the eval section at f5.com. So together, let's take a look at that website. So here we are. If we scroll down just a little bit, so here we have the 90-day trial, we have a lab license, or we can request a full-featured evaluation license that's good for 30 days. So if you choose the 90-day option, let me tell you what to expect. They're going to ask you to sign up for a free F5 account, which has your basic information. And once you're logged in, you have the ability to request licenses. So if you want to have two 90-day evals, just tell them that you need two. And what they'll do if you request two licenses, they will email you two licenses for the 90-day evals, and then you can download and deploy it. Now, last time I checked, this 90-day eval was like version 11.3 of the code. And 11.3 version of the code is a little bit dated. So for example, if we download and we're using 11.3 and then we go to somebody else's network environment and they're using 11.5, we're not going to be totally lost. It's going to be very, very familiar and extremely similar as far as the interface and how things are configured. And one of the benefits of purchasing a lab license is that you can get the latest and greatest version of the software. And as of this recording, it's 11.6 something. But remember, it's not a huge life-changing difference between the interface for 11.3 and 11.6. And if you do want to purchase lab licenses, which is what I chose to do, I just went out to cdw.com and did a search for F5. And I just purchased the licenses through CDW. And regardless of which way we go on this, F5 is going to email us the licenses that we either have requested with the 90-day eval or that we purchased regarding a lab license. And so here I've just gone to cdw.com and I did a quick search for F5 Virtual Edition. And I've got one here for $8,000 and change, which is quite a bit for a lab environment. That would be for the production version. If we scroll down a little bit, Here's the one we want. We want the Big IP Virtual Edition Lab license. And even though it says like version 13.x, which as of this recording is not a version for the actual Big IP appliance, but rather this is supposed to be some type of a version regarding this lab license bundle. The license we purchased, we could go ahead and then use, for example, on version 11.6, which is, as of this recording, a fairly current version of the Big IP appliance. And the lab license is also going to unlock or license the features of the local traffic manager, which is one of our core modules, as well as several other advanced modules that if we want to, we could also use in our lab environment with the license that we purchase here. And that is a very, very affordable way of getting a license that'll function for your lab environment. And what happened with me with CDW, I got a confirmation of my order, and in like 2 or 3 business days, I had emailed to me the license keys that I could then use to license the Big IP virtual appliance. Another important step would be to download the actual software itself from F5. So logged in as the user account that we set up, we'd go to the download section, and here I've done a search for 11.3, and if we scroll down, here we have a download for the Virtual Edition trial for the Big IP Virtual Edition appliance, and it includes the LTM, the Local Traffic Manager module, as part of that. So this, in combination with the eval licenses that were sent to you, we could deploy this virtual machine, and we could then have it there and have it licensed and active in our lab environment for 90 days. Now, on the other hand, if we buy the lab licenses, we can get the latest and greatest version, which currently is 11.6. So down here at the bottom, we have our virtual edition for 11.6. If we select that, there's a license agreement. And then we have the specifics of what we want to download regarding 11.6. And they've got a flavor for Citrix Zen Server. They've got a flavor for VMware. And this one right here, even though it implies that it's for an ESXi host in VMware, it will also run in VMware Workstation. And the list continues. In our case, if we bought the lab license and we intend on deploying it inside of VMware, we'd go ahead and download this file right here. So here we're sitting at the computer, the host that is running VMware Workstation. I happen to be running Windows 8.1 as the native operating system and running VMware Workstation version 11 as the hypervisor environment. And so from within VMware Workstation, we're going to click on File. And then from the drop-down, we'll click on Open. We're going to browse to the location where we have the OVA file. That's the file that we downloaded from F5. And we're simply going to double-click on it to deploy it. So again, whether you're running version 11.3 or 11.6, the process is extremely similar, and once it's deployed, the interface is also very, very similar. And then it's asking me for the name of this virtual machine. Now, I'm going to name this virtual machine BigIP-Test-1. And what I would recommend is that perhaps you practice deploying this a few times before you apply the license that has been sent to you from F5. And if you make a mistake, if you haven't licensed it yet, you're not burning through licenses. I'm also going to specify the location where I want to keep the files for this Big IP appliance. So on this host computer, I've got this drive called X. I've got a folder called VMs. I'm going to make a new folder, and I'm going to call it Big IP Test 1 and click on OK. So now I know exactly where the files will be kept for that virtual machine. And if all of that's in order, I'll simply click on Import. Now the file that we're deploying, it ends with a .ova, which is part of the open virtualization format. And when F5 prepared this OVA, they also built into it this license agreement, which we must accept before it will continue. So we'll read through it all, of course, and then click on Accept. And now it's doing the import of this big IP appliance. And it is done. Now, on this computer, just as a heads up, I do have solid state drives, and so if you're using spinning drives, the actual deployment time may take a little bit longer based on your hardware that's in use. Now, one of the temptations that I have is to go ahead and power this bad boy up. However, what we want to do before we power it up is we want to make sure that we have each of its interfaces connected to the correct VLAN. And to do that, I have a little reminder. This is also included as part of the Nugget Lab files. And what we want to do is make sure that we take each of these 4 network adapters and connect them, if you will, to the correct VLAN that's being provided by our VMware Workstation host. Now, to edit the settings for this big IP virtual appliance, I'm going to right click on the appliance itself. We'll go down to Settings from the drop down, and we'll click on Settings. And then our very next step is we're going to go ahead and we are going to edit these 4 network interfaces, which are represented right here in our table, and make sure that they are mapped correctly to the correct VLAN being provided by the VMware Workstation. So for example, network adapter number 1, that's our first one here, needs to be mapped to VMnet 1. Adapter 2 needs to be mapped to VMnet 0, which is bridged out to my 192.168 network. Adapter number 3 needs to be mapped to VMnet 2. And adapter 4 needs to be mapped to VMnet 3. So to do that, I'm simply going to click on the network adapter, the first one, and specify that I want it to go to virtual network VMnet 1. And that is done. So we'll go to our second adapter. That's going to be bridged, which is the default configuration. So that one's good. Let me take a look at our cheat sheet again. Adapter 3 should go to VMnet 2. So after selecting network adapter 3, we'll go ahead and say we want that to be connected to the VLAN being represented by VMnet 2 on this VMware Workstation. And then the final one is adapter 4, which needs to go to VMnet 3. So we'll select adapter 4 from the virtual machine, click on custom once again, and put that in VMnet 3. And you'll notice when we click that, it doesn't immediately show it, but if we click on something else, for example, it then reflects those mappings. So just as a verification, network adapter 1 is in VMnet 1. That's correct. Adapter 2 is bridged, and that automatic bridging is happening through VMnet 0, and so that's good. Network adapter 3 is connected to VMnet 2. That's in shape. And then finally, adapter 4 on the virtual machine is being mapped to the VLAN that's being represented by VMnet 3. And that looks perfect as well. Now, one of the reasons I have this graphic up side by side as I verify this is that if we don't have interfaces in the correct VLAN, in the correct broadcast domains, we're going to have one heck of a time getting it to work correctly. So somebody once said, if layer 1 and layer 2 aren't happy, ain't nobody happy. And that is very true, including the use of application delivery controllers and their interfaces. So because that does look correct, I'm going to go ahead and click on OK. We can now go ahead and click on power on this virtual machine, and it is off to the races. And you might ask yourself, well, what do we do next? And that's a great question, and we're going to cover that in the next nugget. In this nugget, you and I are taking a look at methods that we can use to get licensed copies of the Big IP platform so that we can practice with F5's application delivery controller in our lab environment. We've also identified how in a VMware Workstation environment we can deploy that virtual machine and get the interfaces of that virtual appliance into the correct VLANs in preparation for the initial bootstrapping and configuration of the F5 appliance itself. I am glad you joined me for this nugget. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.